Welcome everyone to the 16th annual Celebrating Words Festival, written, performed, and sung. This festival is hosted by Tia Chucha Centro Cultural and honors the teaching that our words are medicine found in our stories, creative arts, and cultural offerings. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Marta Escobar. I teach in Chicano Studies at California State University, Northridge, and I work with Project Rebound, which is a program for formerly incarcerated students. I'm going to be moderating today's panel on the documentary From Trauma to Transformation. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelist. Giovanni Solis, Gio, is a Los Angeles-based photographer and filmmaker. He received a bachelor's in fine arts and film production with an emphasis in cinematography from CSUN in 2012. He now focuses on his passion, which is street photography and documentary and narrative filmmaking. Through his work, he aims to find ways to preserve the sensitive moments of life while sharing them. Gio considers himself to be a student and recorder of everyday life while allowing himself to exit the mind and divulge in his surroundings. His experience is a mixture of straight photography, humanity, personal sensitivities, and creating images that have an emotion of their own. He believes his images should make you feel, and anything less than that just doesn't work. So Gio, thank you so much for all of the work that you put into creating this film project.
Oh, thank you so much, Martha.
No, I know it's a lot of work. I can only imagine. So thank you. Our next panelist is Kesasi Hill. After serving 27 years and 8 months in prison, Kesasi now uses poetry and the art of spoken word to reach and empower at-risk youth and adults. He's worked with youth groups like Motivatum Inc., Youth Mentoring, Youth Mentors Connect, the Du Bois Institute for Boys, Tia Chucha Centro Cultural, and the Timeless Group Reentry Program and Youth Mentoring. Kesasi, we are so grateful for your voice and willingness to share your experiential knowledge with us so often. You were just at CISA not that long ago, so I'm grateful for that. Luis Rodriguez is the founder of Tia Chucha Centro Cultural and From Trauma to Transformation. He's a leading Chicano writer and renowned gang intervention urban peace leader. Luis has taught creative writing in prisons for almost 40 years, traveled extensively in the US and abroad to read poetry, do workshops and speak, including in prisons, juvenile lockups, universities, colleges, schools, homeless shelters, libraries, and more. As a teen gang member and drug user, Luis was jailed several times. Since leaving that life, he has been involved in seeking systemic social change for over 40 years, with extensive experience, analysis, and insight on healing through the arts and community building. And our final panelist, and I know you visited CSUN several times, Luis. I'm just realizing like we're all connected to CSUN in one way or another, so I'm excited now. Well, I was excited, but even more now. Our final panelist is Rebecca Gomez. Rebecca is a coordinator from Trauma to Transformation. She grew up in the Inland Empire of San Bernardino County. This experience fueled her involvement in community and activism within social justice movements. In 2018, she came to Tia Chuchas to help build, coordinate, and oversee From Trauma to Transformation. And we hope everybody had the opportunity to view the documentary. If you haven't done so already, please do so. It's an incredible film that really shows the power of art in transforming lives. For those of you that are joining us, please send us your questions through Facebook or YouTube, and we're going to do the best job we can to get your questions asked to the panelists. For now, I don't see any questions in the chat, so if it's okay with folks, I'm gonna start off with Rebecca. As a coordinator of the program Trauma to Transformation, I wanted to, there might be some folks that haven't viewed the film yet. So can you share with everyone the origins and purpose of the program?
Hi. So the Trauma to Transformation program is a program that was started in 2018 but it was also just inspired by Luis's work for over, as we heard, 40 years. This project started in 2018 through the Arts for Justice Fund. Thanks to them, we were able to bring on myself and the teaching artists like Kesasi, Mateo, and all the other folks that work with us in the prisons and the juvenile halls. And we were really drawn to that message of the arts as a way of healing and also amplifying our voices, and figuring out the root of who we are, and all the addressing what we need to, let's say, the traumas that we bring in, so that we can transform and heal. So that's part of what trauma transformation is, our perspective when we're doing programs. We have programs with folks that are both adults and youth who have been impacted by the mass incarceration. So we do this also to highlight the stories and have folks, the community, be on board on bringing change to end the issue of mass incarceration by sharing out these narratives through the arts. So that's pretty much the origin. It started in 2018 with the Achuchas, and it still is going on to this day. So yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. And so for formerly incarcerated folks impacted by the criminal legal system, so a good way to connect with the program would be to go to Teachucha's website and look up the contact information. And we'll put that contact information. Actually, people don't have the chat, right? But people can Google Teachucha's and contact you directly that way, no?
Yeah.
Luis, so really recently, we just connected with the student who's formerly incarcerated, and she's going through a really, really difficult time right now. And we're having a reading group in the summer, and she's like, Marta, that's awesome. Reading has been so important. And she mentioned, she's like, you know what, in my worst moment, I read Luis Rodriguez's Always Running, and it changed my life, right? And so this was just like last week, and I didn't know I was gonna be here with you. So I think it speaks to the power, the power of the work that you've done as a writer, as an artist. So I wanted to ask you, how did you begin your journey as an artist? And also what led to creating this program, From Trauma to Transformation?
So I would say that the main thing was the movimiento, what we call the movement, the social justice, civil rights struggles of the 60s. I was taken up by the words of Malcolm X, James Baldwin, Eldridge Cleaver, all those, George Jackson, all those that were writing, coming out of the prisons, either around it or with it. Malcolm X in particular, but also the Puerto Rican Perry Thomas was my favorite writer when I was a teenager. Books were my saving grace. And because even though I was in a gang, I was homeless, I was in and out of jails, I was always in the library. I love books, man. And when I was homeless at 15, I would go downtown to the Central Library and that was my refuge. I spent hours there. And these books were there. They were coming out. And they're very instrumental. So by the time that I was back in the neighborhood and trying to get things going, I met Chicano activists from the Movimiento, Brown Berets, people who founded the Brown Berets, people involved with La Raza Unida and all kinds of movements. And I got taken by it. It swept me up because I really was hungry. Being in the gang, I didn't know how hungry it was for knowledge and revolution. You know what I mean? I didn't know. I thought it was just going to be for the barrio. You get you just think about just your little neighborhood and your homies, but then the whole world opened up to me. I wish it had taken up more of my homies, because unfortunately I got many ways pulled out of that life because of the movimiento, but a lot of my homies didn't. So many of them ended up dead from heroin overdoses, shot and killed. I lost 25 friends by the time I was 18 or in prison. So one thing I felt was very important, that even though I didn't do all that hard prison time that others had done, I felt an obligation to go back in the institutions. And I did that when I was about 25 years old. I started in Chino prison, working with my mentor and guide, Manasar Gamboa, who people don't know him, but he's a Chicano, very important mentor and leader for many of us in the 70s. What happened is that he spent 17 years in prison and was a heroin addict for 20 years, came out, and again, books, writing, poetry changed his life. And he became my teacher and mentor. And then we went into Chino prison, and they allowed him, which at the time you couldn't be a formerly incarcerated person to come in, but they let him come in, and he brought me into his classes. And I got stuck. I loved it. I love being in the classes. I love being among these guys and later some women. And I've been doing it for over 40 years. And again, generally it's one-time stuff. I do a poetry reading, I do a talk, healing circle, but I've also had many, many years doing these writing classes. I spent at Lancaster State Prison, I think I've been since 2007. I've been teaching creative writing there. And now I've got 2 other prisons that I'm doing lesson plans for, even during the pandemic. So this is the reason why Theo Trauma Transformation was started, because of that work that I was doing in the juvenile facilities, in the prisons and jails. All over the country now, I've gone to close to 18 other states, and around the world, I've gone to prisons in Mexico and in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Argentina, England, Italy. I've gone to, around the world. Trauma transformation was the idea that whatever I had learned in utilizing writing, but also poetry and the arts and expressive capacities that people have to transform their lives, we decided that we would create it as part of a Tia Chucha program.
Just let me follow up really quickly, Luis, in terms of the impact of the program. Actually, let me go to Kesasi. Because in terms of the impact, I think you're part of that, right? The impact that the program has had. In the film, Kesasi, there's you're featured as one of the program teachers, right? You're teaching folks how to write poetry, and then there's a little bit of hesitation from many of the folks to claim the identity of poet, right? They're like, I'm not a poet, I'll write, but I'm not a poet. So can you share a little bit about your healing process, especially the role of poetry in that process, and what trauma to transformation means to you?
And it's a trip you say that, because I did that. I used to always say, I'm not a poet. I'm not a poet. And, and I was animate about it. But the whole time I'm writing poetry. So when I started first writing poetry, I was in YTS, which was a youth facility. Now, it was a youth facility that prepared you for prison. So it wasn't just like a, juvenile. We were all juveniles, but we were high crime juveniles that were being prepared for the California Department of Corrections. It's just that we were too young at the time to be placed among the adults. So they housed us at the California Youth Authority. And it was in this place that I was actually at my worst, and I'm talking about I was engulfed in the gangs as an identity, and some people do it because of circumstances. For me, it was an identity. So when I entered into the Youth Authority, I fought all the time. And I fought so much that I had made a vow that none of my enemies could come into my class until we fought first. So what they did was ban me from high school classes. I couldn't go to any classes except for this one teacher named John Murphy, who allowed me into the class. And but what he did is he put me on a computer most of the time. And the computer had a video game on it, but the video game was actually related to vocabulary. So I was playing vocabulary video games, not realizing I'm learning. And so we had an essay we had to do, not an essay, but an assignment where we had to write poetry. And he put up a prompt and he said we had to write from this prompt, whatever it is that, was up there. And I refused to write. And he said, man, if you can't get on the computer unless you finish this writing. So he said, just get it out the way, finish the writing, then you can go to the computer. So I wrote it. And I don't recall what I wrote, but whatever it was I wrote, he changed he corrected the grammar, the spelling and everything. And he read the poem out loud. And I knew they were my words, but the way he read it, I was like, wow, I was shocked, like those were mine. And he was like, yeah. And then he told the whole class, he wrote it. This guy wrote it. So everyone is shocked about me writing this poem. And but what I realized is it was easy for me to express what I was feeling at the time without the fear of judgment. You see, because it was in the name of art. And see, art is judged differently. Art isn't taken literally oftentimes. So I was able to express myself in a way that was healing, and it was expressive, or, it was opening. And at the same time, I was shielded by the aspect of it's just a poem, don't take it serious. But it was my greatest honesty at the time. So yeah, and then after a while, I never stopped after that. Even when I made it to the Department of Corrections, and I went through all of the traumas there, and ultimately doing 98 days in solitary confinement. And I always say that was the moment I became a poet. When I was in a youth authority, that's when I began to write poetry. But I identified myself as a poet when I spent 98 days in solitary confinement. And the only thing that I could do was write poetry on the wall. And I covered the entire cell with poetry, from the ceiling to everything. And they brought the psychs in to see if I was writing anything suicidal or if I, threatened to harm anybody. But what they found was it was just poetry. And it was in that time that I used the poetry, the alphabets, as runes to keep the walls in place, so it was like magic for me. So when I came out, there was no shame in it for me. There was no shame in my emotion. There was no shame in my struggles. There was no shame in my trauma. And most of all, there was no shame in the process of my healing.
That's incredible, Kesasi. How did you connect to trauma, from trauma to transformation?
Fate. Now, when I first got out, I didn't know what to do. I left the streets at 16 years old. So my world perception was based on what I left at the age of 16 years old. So I had to reallocate myself to society. I had to, learn new sounds, because you don't hear a dog bark in prison. When we talk about trauma, you don't hear a dog bark. You don't hear a child laugh. You don't hear a woman's voice. You don't see certain colors. You don't smell. You don't smell, Taco Bell on the corner. You don't smell, exhaust from cars, because there are no cars in prison. There are no dogs in prison. There are no children in prison. So we forget that after so many decades of being deprived of these sensories, you get out and all of this stuff is coming down on you, right? And I didn't know really what I want. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to go about doing it. And someone told me to go to this place called Mendocino. It was a men's group in Mendocino. And I got a chance to hear Luis speak. And when I heard him speak and I heard him deliver that poem, and I found out that he was from Pacoima, to me, it was heaven sent. I was like, that's it. The universe always works out for me. It always puts the people in my path that's necessary to be in my path to help me to do whatever good that there is to do in the world. And Luis was that person at the time. And it gets even crazier, because when he came up a few years later, I ran into his son on the bus on my way to work. And he said, hey, my dad was looking for you. He has this program called Trauma to Transformation. He wants to talk to you about it. And after that, there was no turning back. There was no turning. It was like the perfect place. I was supposed to be there.
That's such an incredible story, Kesasi. Thank you for sharing. Gio, I have a question for you, and then we have a few folks, a few questions from the chat. So part of the collective healing that we need to do is to build community, and the healing that we need to do is tell our stories. Storytelling is such an important part of that, right? Which is a message that you're all conveying. So what story are you trying to tell with this film? And what were some of the difficult decisions you had to make about what to include and what to leave out as you were putting the film together?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it was just like trying to follow like the natural narratives that were just being presented to us. Like there was a lot of things that were captured that like I didn't necessarily even recall or even like clock while we were filming it. Like there's moments where if like Isaú or moments with Kesasi, that it wasn't until the editing process I was like, oh wow, there's all this stuff that's happening. You know what I mean? And it wasn't until like you start picking up these different strands and like kind of holding them all out. You're like, there's like a lot of connectivity from different people going through like similar things in different places. So I felt like I was trying to just like make all of that just cohesive and also like be as like um faithful to like the conversations I've had with like Luis and like because I feel like so much of this is like based on like the work that he's created, you know, and like this framework that he's made, and also like what Mateo was doing in the workshops, what Kesasi was doing in the workshops. So I felt like it was more of just trying to like get all of the stuff that I heard over like 2.5 years and just try to get it in like a 45-minute container. So I felt like that was incredibly challenging because there's just so much, like there's so many like through lines or so much like narrative that we collected from different people that didn't make it into this piece just because of like how small the 45-minute window is. So and it's tough because it's like there's so much profound stuff that is like that doesn't necessarily didn't work in this edit, but it still feels very important to figure out a way to how we can get those stories out there, because it does feel like, you know, healing and trauma is just feels so universal, you know. And like I think that was one of my major like entry points throughout the process. I was like, besides like the incarceration aspect of it, it's just like this is like keys to healing, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. How do you make those decisions, right? What gets included, what doesn't get included, and how do you then what happens to all that other stuff which is still so meaningful? So it's thinking through ways of sharing that. So there are a few questions from the chat. The first one somebody wrote, and they're not mentioning it to anybody, directing it to anybody. So anybody who wants to answer, please feel free. Racism, poverty, and other ways to divide people are all difficult hurdles for us to overcome. What are ways you have been able to connect these issues in a coherent way to allow for healing? So they're talking about racism, poverty, all these other issues. These are hurdles that our communities are facing. How do we make sense of that, and how do we heal from that?
Yeah, let me weigh in on that. I think that all those things, racism, the class society we're in, the impoverishment, the terrible divisions are inside of us too. In other words, the culture of the world makes us who we are. We're divided all kinds of ways, and we go into institutions, whether it's prisons or anywhere, with all these divisions and all this animosity. It's already built in. In other words, it is part of who we are. So when we're talking about healing, we're just not talking about the personal, particular healing that a person has to go to, because that particular healing also has a gradient with what society has done. You know what I'm saying? So we have to think about the historical traumas, the colonial traumas that have been put down on us for being people of color or being poor people. And they all have to be addressed. And what happens in the workshops that I do, I allow all that to be dealt with, you know. So I don't think it's about blaming all these things, obviously, but it's about understanding, examining the world that you're in, your internal world as well as external world. Know your environment. What happened? What contributed to making you who you were? So that you can see your end of it, because that's important to take accountability for what you've done, but to also see how society helps shape you so you don't get caught up in their traps. You know what I'm saying? The traps that they make up on the way through your life. So it works out pretty good to make sure that people address race, address class, address poverty, address all these things while also addressing their particular end of it, you know, so that they can empower themselves to say, I can do something about all those things as well as my own life. Oh, yeah. Before I forget, let me just add, we got to mention the Art for Justice Fund. I don't want to forget, they helped us get the funding that allow us to now make this most funded program we have at the Chuchas, because it allowed us to get into the prisons, to the juvenile halls, to the parolee housing, to places that were closed off. And we're bringing artists, we're bringing poets, we're bringing theater people into these institutions. And the Art for Justice Fund, I have to say, was instrumental. So we got to mention them because I don't want it to go by. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for your previous comment, because it can be so easy to get overwhelmed with how messed up the world is, how heavy it is, right? And how do we wrap our head around all of that and still come out fighting and still come out wanting to create change, right? So I think it's your comments are really important to that. I think this question is kind of more directed to Rebecca. Let me, and other people can chime in as well. The person wrote, "Thank you for all the amazing work you have all done in healing people's lives. What barriers did you encounter in the creation of From Trauma to Transformation and in creating the documentary, and how did you overcome those barriers?" So I think it's going to be a combination of folks that respond to that question.
I guess a barrier that could keep us from starting and from continuing is that let's say to be able to pay folks for this work, there's always that thing about having to prove like your impact instead of it just coming from the spirit. You know, how do you prove that so that you can keep these programs going? And I think that I find that programs that are measuring impact are in a way that's in a structure that's about the system that is toxic. So it's like, why are we trying to fit a mold within the system and try to do prove an impact to that to get to keep funding the project and keep it going when the measurements of success aren't always going to be from that space of that's about our spirit, you know? So I think that can be a barrier for at least for, let's say, keeping this work going, is how do you measure that and have support in that way.
Thank you. Gio, did you want to chime in a little bit and some of the difficulties of creating the documentary, or Luis or Kesasi, anybody else?
Yeah, I can definitely chime in about it. I think the greatest challenge, I think, was just that, like, how rich, like, I think a lot of like what like Kesasi and Luis and like the multiple people in this documentary and what they're talking about. And it's just like trying to like condense that, you know, where it feels like it just feels so large and also like so multifaceted and like nuanced, and just trying to like synthesize that. I think that more like in a narrative way. And I think part of it was also just in the filming of it. Like, it was very hard for us to get like access to like film inside of like the prisons. And even at like the Orion House in like Van Nuys, like I think it took us about like 3 to 4 weeks of going to the workshops before we were able to film half the class. So it was like, we definitely were like developing relationships with people as we were going. And like at certain points, it was kind of like, oh, like, are we going to even be able to film at this certain thing? So if we're not going to be able to film here, how are we going to tell this story, you know? So I felt like that kind of created some kind of like short-term challenges. But I think in the end, just because of like how rich like the central people were, that we were able to kind of overcome those things.
Yeah, relationship building is so important as part of this process, right? Building relationships with folks, and even folks that, you know, that would not allow you necessarily to have access to these stories, and that you were able to do that. So that's amazing. And Kesasi, there's a question for you. The person wrote, "What an amazing story, Kesasi. Did they ever take pictures of the poetry in your cell walls?" And then they wrote, "Luis Rodriguez and Tia Chuchas are my angels too." So the question is, did they ever take pictures of what you wrote?
Well, they did take pictures, but they didn't take them for, you know, the benefit of, you know, oh, this is such beautiful art. They took it as a record for my mental state, you know. So when they did take the pictures, they put them in my central file, my prison central file. So So there is a record of it, but as far as the pictures, there's only one poem that I remember for sure that was on that wall, and it's called Dear Mama. And it was a poem that I had wrote to my mother. And that one made it into the book, Serengeti Noise, that I wrote when I got out. So I wish I did have all of the poems that I wrote, on that wall. I think that in itself would be a whole nother story to tell.
That's so interesting, Kesasi. What kept you sane in that space, right? Writing poetry is what was being used to try to claim that you had some type of mental illness. That's just the irony in that is so interesting. Would you have access to that file at some point if you asked for it?
Well, I never tried to get my central file from prison, because once I left prison, I said they can have it and everything in it, right? I was only concerned about what I can, build from this moment on, But yeah, my central file was so thick that I had two of them this big. And that's from write-ups, from disciplinary infractions, and because I was caught up in, like I said, the gang identity and the culture itself was my identity. So I rose within the ranks of the prison and this politics, at the top of the food chain. So, but that came with a price. That came with a price as it related to my freedom. It came as a price as it related to the mental stress that I had to go through, because now people want to kill you specifically, so when you make it up that high, people know you that you don't know. And remember, we're living in a colony of societies rejected. These are the people, that are classified as sociopaths because they got rid of Patton State Hospital. They got rid of Tuscadero. What do you think that they did with those people? They put them in Folsom and Lancaster, in Soledad. So these were my community members, right? So I had to find a way, for me to keep my sanity or keep a record of my own sanity, because the environment I was living in itself was insane. In fact, where I did the SHU term, the 98 days, the solitary confinement, is the same yard that Luis teaches the poetry on, Lancaster B yard. And he can tell you about, the reputation of that yard. And I was there before Luis got there. I ended up leaving there in '99. So yeah, it was a notorious, yard, to say the least. And I survived at the top of the food chain. That's not a brag. That's a reflection, because that means that I could not have been the person that you're speaking of today. For me to survive in that environment, there was no way I could be the person that you're speaking to today. And what made it beautiful was the person that you're speaking to today was always there. It wasn't until I was birthed out of that solitary confinement. Once I was on the brink of insanity, where the old me had to be utterly and literally destroyed, was I able to be the person that my mother named and gave birth to.
Martha, let me say a few words of that, because that's powerful, what Kesasi's story is and how he says it. Language to me is a power, and it could be used destructively and it could be used constructively. What Kesasi and a lot of these guys have learned is they can either curse the world or bless it. Whatever they've been through, all their lessons, all their stumbling, all their mistakes could all be blessings to the world, teaching others, give them wisdom, or curses. And Kesasi had made that choice, and he made it in prison to bless the world. Whether he did it consciously or not, it was a choice that was done. And that's what he's done now with his words, with his teachings, going to the institutions, going back to places that he came out of, and going and working with people who used to think the same way he thought. To me, that's transformation. And one thing that's important, there's a line by Theodore Rothke, the poet, that really talks about this madness issue in a way that I think is better perspective, which is what is madness but a nobility of soul at odds with circumstance. And that's the way I feel that all of us get caught up. This capitalist world of kill, be killed, do or die, borders, nation states, everything is a madness. They say that's normal. That's the way it is. It's all made up stuff, and it's very destructive to our souls. The bottom line. The way that we're constantly trying to get over on people, the scarcity, which is all made up. We get caught up in a madness that they created. You know what I'm saying? And so when we try to pull away from it, either by even being more mad than they are, so you think you're mad, you don't know what madness is, or we try to do it by other ways. We're called the people are insane. You know what I'm saying? We're pushed out. We're dismissed. But I find that in the prisons, a lot of these men and women that finally get, and a lot of them do, they get it, they understand. They become more sane than anybody. It's really amazing how you think, in a prison, what kind of madness is that? That you can find people who find their sanity and their centering and their home inside themselves, not their home in prison. Nobody wants to be home in prison, even though everybody tries to make a home out of prison. That's not really your home. Your home is inside here. And that's what they learn. It's inside themselves, no matter where they go. So there's a lot of men and women like Kesasi. He happens to be a particular way of carrying his genius. And that's important, because my whole thing is everybody's got a genius. And Kesasi carries his way and with a lot of dignity, which is another thing that I know I've seen him struggle with. I know he's been pushed up against the wall. At these men's conferences, some of these men can really get you there. They could trigger anybody. I've been going to these men conferences for over 25 years. I was working with Michael Mead, a great teacher and a good friend, and others. And I've seen Kesasi get there, but I've also seen Kesasi find his cadencia, his centering, his home. He gets centered, and then his language comes through, and there's nothing gets in the way of that beautiful sweep of language, which has beauty in it and has truth and has a lot of decency, believe it or not. So I think that's what we want these men and women to get to that point where they can find it. And I use language. It could be art, it could be music, it could be all kinds of things. I use language. It's very powerful, and I've seen it over and over again, even with some guys that people have written off. And that's why you don't read off anybody. I'm not saying not everybody's going to be getting that, but you don't write off anybody. You don't know how it's going to come through in their life.
Thank you. Reese, I'm going to go back to the film really quickly because I think there's something really important that was said in the film, which is the idea of accountability. This question of when people harm, right? When people harm others, what does accountability mean? And in the film, you said accountability doesn't necessarily have to mean punishment, right? Accountability doesn't have to mean punishment. So I wanted to see if you could expand on that a little bit. What do you mean by that? Because I think part of the work that you're doing is imagining the unimaginable, right? The fact that we can have a different world. It doesn't have to be this way. So if you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think if you're going to be accountable in your life, and accountable comes from the business world, where you're taking your money in one end and you see if it's going to jive in the other end. But you can do that. It's a metaphor. How do you take an inventory of what you've been through? And if you're going to be accountable to yourself, to the world, then you have to address whatever you've done, own it, and then transcend it. You know what I mean? In other words, don't let that thing be your what holds you back or defines you after a while. You got to own what you've done. I did it. I did terrible things, but you've also done amazing things. You've also overcome a lot of things. And transcendence to me is really important part of the healing. If you're going to do an accountability thing with people, you have to include healing as part of it. That's why I tell people it isn't just about punishment. I mean, people say, well, there's consequences. I believe in consequences, but consequences have to include healing, has to include what we call art, A-R-T, addressing the issue, repairing whatever was broken or needed to be repaired, and transforming. And transforming doesn't mean you become a different person. I actually think it means you become more what you're supposed to have been. That's really what it means. Not transform. I'm going to be different. You're going to be more what society pushed away from you, what knocked it out of you, forced you to be a mutated human being for whatever reason, and you have to take accountability for your end of it. But at the same time, you got to say, I'm going to be more what I was meant to be. Well, my genius that I had the day I was born, that got thrown off all kinds of ways, but now I can get back to it at this level of knowledge and wisdom. So that's what I think it has to do with ART, addressing, repairing, and transforming.
And I think that's such an important message, right? The fact that punishment doesn't necessarily make us safer. The United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, right? And we're not safer for it. And so what we have right now, resorting to that kind of punitive punishment, isn't working to make us safer. So how do we transform ourselves, our communities, so that we do get to a better place with each other? And that's such an important question, right?
Well, let me add something on that. To go into prisons every year now, it wasn't that way before. You had to go to training. The training was done with COs and staff. The instructors got trained with them. So that kind of changed. But when I was first going to the training, you would sit down with all these guys that are going to be guards, going to be staff. All right. So at one point, somebody was talking about punishment. These people, they got to be punished. And I told them, well, listen, I'm going to tell you what the problem was with all that. They're not going to be released into your neighborhood. You can tell this person lived in a probably white upper class neighborhood. You can tell. Says, they're going to be released in my neighborhood. And you're actually endangering my neighborhood unless you do the proper healing, transformative work with them. If you don't do that, you're actually endangering me and my community. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to let them know that, listen, man, in prison, and Kesasi, my son, by the way, did 15 years. So my son's always teaching me too about all this stuff. You learn something. You learned all kinds of things. And you either learn really good, decent, powerful ways to go, or you learn all the other ways. You're learning something. Thinking that you put people away in bars and they're just sitting there just waiting for whatever is a foolish thing. They learn to be better criminals, better predators, or they learn to be better human beings. You know what I'm saying? And again, that's where the more conscious and intentional we are, then it isn't punishment that we want. And we want to bring out that part of them, which I think all human beings have, that is about the truth and the beauty and the decency. We have to work on that. Otherwise, punishing them makes them want to punish others.
Yeah. And how do we provide people what people need before having to be in that situation where they do end up engaging in actions that lead to incarceration, right? Because what you were saying earlier, the fact that we push people into those situations, how can we rethink about how we organize ourselves so that people have basic needs met, food, shelter, love, the things that we need to thrive in the world. Kesasi, in the film, we witnessed a lot of people, especially men, being vulnerable and sharing their stories and a lot of pain, right? And several of the folks in the film note that they were taught when they were growing up not to be emotional, not to share their feelings. How did you get to the point, and you kind of already talked about this, but if you could elaborate a little bit more, how did you get to the point where you could be vulnerable in front of others? And how do you teach others to do the same? Because that's such an important part of the healing process, right?
It is. And you see, the thing is, it's not that I call it crazy baby making system, where they come up and they teach babies that boys don't cry. That's the beginning of insanity, where you detach the male from emotion. And the only emotion that we identify with is anger. And we're comfortable in our anger, but anything else outside of that becomes uncomfortable. And it's reflective in our everyday lives. It's reflective in our relationship with our parents, in our relationship with our spouses, in our relationships with our family members. And we don't know how to address these things because we've never gone to a school or any type of program that sat us down and told us that emotion was as natural as a sunrise and a full moon, you see? And we don't have to feel weakened or less than for identifying with those emotions. Now, one thing we have to get them to know is that anger is an emotion. And once we get them to, to identify with the anger and the resentment, which is easy for most of us to do, then it's easy to get them to identify with emotion, period. Because now we get to point out, wait a minute, anger is not the only emotion. And if emotions is your problem, you have a problem with dealing with emotion, then what about these other emotions? What is that health like? Because you have physical health, mental health, and emotional health. What is this health like? Do you have a healthy, loving relationship? Do you cry? And that's another thing I asked. When you were in prison, did you cry? And all of them say, yeah. Now, the problem is, did you metamorphose into another sex? Did you become a woman because of those tears? Or did you feel liberated after those tears? You see what I'm saying? So we take away personal stigma and social perceptions and replace it with the human element of nature. This is human for us to love and to cry. Now we got to get, into the thing. How do we touch that? Poetry. Poetry is that one art that gives you the ability to be able to be sentimental without judgment. Because with poetry, there is an expectation of honesty, raw honesty, and sentiment. So once we get them into, this is poetry, and they accept that, then we'll find that in that art and in that poetry, they'll start to accept those other emotional dysfunctions that they may have in their lives. They'll at least be able to identify them. If they're not able to accept them and to deal with them, at least they've made it to a point where they can identify them. And once they identify them, and they know that they're there, then they can over time, work with it. And poetry is that journaling, and it's that art that helps you to be able to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Kesasi. As I watched the film, I remembered a conversation I had with one of my students. He's formerly incarcerated. He was incarcerated since the age of 12, really. And so he talked about how, as a kid, because he was a guy, he was allowed to be out on the streets and his sisters were not. So the idea of how toxic masculinity, right, doesn't just harm women, but it harms men themselves, because then at that point he was vulnerable, right, to different forms of violence. And so I think that's an important point that's made in the film, right? Like, toxic masculinity isn't just about harming women. It actually harms everyone, including men. So thank you for that. We have a question from the chat. They wrote, this project is heavy work. How did you all take care of your own mental health during the process? Sorry, Kesasi, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to add to the toxic masculinity, because when we talk about who all does toxic masculinity affect or harm, remember, toxic masculinity affects the person that's toxic first. It's your masculinity that's toxic. So the first person that's harmed by toxic masculinity is the person who's, living through or expressing or identifying with that toxicity.
Which is often missed, right? Which is often the fact that it's actually harming that person is such an important point. Going back to this question, how do you all take care of your mental health, of your well-being as you're doing this work? Because it's such heavy work.
Yeah, and I think that's such a very important, we got to find our renewing spaces. We got to regenerate. This work is so heavy. I've been doing it a long time, and I'm telling you, I've seen people come and go. People get burned out. People, good people, and now they're like, I can't do it no more. You have to learn how to renew and regenerate, and that really is what I call having the proper healing practices. Because to me, I think it should be a practice. You do it on a regular. Writing for me is a practice. Even if I don't have a particular project, I'm writing. I don't have to just, this is going to be a book. I don't even know half the time what it's going to be. It might end up as a book, as a poem, whatever. The point is a practice. It gets me, like, again, back to that cadencia, that home, that centering. Every day we get discombobulated. There's so much going on. And then this practice for me pulls me back together so I can stay strong in the struggle. You know what I mean? And then when I start getting off, my edges start flaying. I got to find that. And you got to do it on a regular basis. That's why it's a practice. There are spiritual practices that, of course, a lot of people do. In the prison, they do meditative, meditation. They do all kinds of things. There's, of course, religious, if that's your thing, going to a church, whatever helps you get that place. That doesn't always, to me, seem to be the most spiritual places, and I'm not saying something that people don't know. Church can be spiritual, but I've been to churches, there's no spirit in it. I'm telling you. On the other hand, that point of getting engaged with spirit is important, and that takes practice, and it's spiritual and or artistic. And sometimes your artistic practice is the spiritual practice. So I would just say that having those kind of practices and collective community that you can go to is very important.
And I think one of the points that you're making, it has to be intentional. You have to be intentional that you're working towards your well-being, right? Yeah,
it's very important because, people say, well, the spirit everywhere and everything's sacred, and is all true, but the intention puts you present in it. You know what I'm saying? And that's why people stumble into spirit, or they stumble into these moments. Even Kesasi says somehow synchronicity, the world put him in places it happened for him. But what's happened now that he's a person that thinks about things and is aware, he's now intentionally entering those spaces. And that's very important to get to that point where you can do it. I'm doing it intention. I'm finding the sacred in what I'm doing.
Anybody else want to add to that? How do you care for yourselves? How do you care for your mental well-being?
Well, it's like Luis said, sometimes the spirit is in the art itself. And for me, when I say that writing saved my life, it did. It literally. Because if I didn't write, where would I have been? What kind of person would I have been? Remember, everything that had to do with writing, every benefit and every success in my life, whether it was going to college while in prison, taking vocation, it all had to do with me beginning to write and actually come into grips with who I was, because it was in my writing that I was discovering who I was, because I was able to find my voice. I was able to find my reasoning. I was able to find my own understanding. So when I made a decision based on that, that awareness of who I was, that presence in who I was. And so much so that I even looked at art as something spiritual. I mean, poetry as something spiritual, down to the alphabets themselves. I was like, man, alphabets are runes. And runes are symbol used for magic. And if you put runes together, these runes together are called spells. And that's why they call it spelling. You see? So to me, the journal is my grimoire. The pen is my wand, or the pencil is my wand, and the words are my runes, and my, the poetry itself is the magic. And the result of that magic is how people receives it. And to me, that's always healing. That's always healing. And I think that's what's important. When we talk about making change in the judicial system, making change, is the change that needs to be made comes from within. We need those people's voices to be heard. Because, oftentimes we rely on other people to tell the stories of those who are being afflicted by the most oppression. But if you heard the voice of the oppressed themselves, it would be far more impactful. And this is why they try so hard to silence them. And this is why, this program, Trauma to Transformation, is so necessary, because what it does is it empowers people with a voice that otherwise they didn't believe that they had.
Thank you. Thank you both for your comments. I'm being mindful of time, but I do have a few more questions. So if you bear with me. Gio, I often think that we come to the work that we do because we're personally connected to a lot of it, right? So I wanted to ask you, why did you decide to take on this project, and what does it mean to you? Are you connected to this work in a particular way, or just the folks that you may have some connections to?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a combination. Like, I've had a relationship with like Mike Centeno and Tia Chuchas for like multiple years, and like I grew up in the Valley. My aunt was like incarcerated for like the majority of my life. My dad was incarcerated. There's plenty of people that just like grown up that I have met that have also been incarcerated. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was just like, part of it was just in Tia Chucha's wanting to create this kind of piece of work and trying to figure out how to honor it, but also for me being in the process with everyone in this documentary of trying to figure out, how do you heal from trauma? Because it's like, I experienced trauma, my parents experienced trauma, the communities that like I come from and I care about, are all impacted by trauma. And I'm constantly trying to figure out, like, how do you support people? How do you heal from it? So I think a lot of the conversations I was having with people were just internal questions I was asking, and I'm still asking, so yeah, like I definitely felt, definitely pulled in the work, but I didn't feel like as much of a distance in the process. I mean, I definitely felt like respectful for people and the fact that they were being vulnerable and putting their stories in front of the camera and telling their story. But it was something that I kept kind of thinking about throughout the whole process, and even like the conversations I was having with Luis throughout this, or Kesasi, I would like ruminate and like think about it, and also like apply it to my life, or also bestow it on people that I knew in my day-to-day life. So it was definitely kind of like an interesting like 2.5, 3 years of like growing with the project. Like, I feel like even going back and hearing some of the first conversations we had in the documentary in like 2018 to like some of the most recent conversations we had, I feel like I was definitely using a lot of the frameworks that I was learning from Kesasi and Luis, which is great, because I also feel like even in the community work that I'll do going forward, the documentary work that I'll do going forward, even just how I show up in the communities that I'm a part of, I continue with this framework, So it also feels like, even beyond like the piece of art, it's been just really impactful in that kind of way.
That's so interesting. I think the whole project, Trauma to Transformation, and making the film has been such a strength-based approach, right? That everybody has something to contribute if nurtured, right? And then the point that you're making about living or being the transformation, that making the film itself has transformed you. Now you're living, right, those lessons that you've learned in the making. So it's just so powerful. Rebecca, so, and everybody, what impact have you witnessed the Trauma to Transformation program have, and what goals do you have for the program as you move forward?
I feel like I've seen folks what I love to see is when I see another person connect with the other person, and I love to see that in the classroom, with with all the teatro that Mateo would do. There is a way to facilitate a class to make sure there's elements to bring people together and make people open up, and just like be able to see each other like genuinely and support them and see each other. And I feel like that's something that I've seen in the classroom with Kesasi too, and with the other folks that I work with the youth. I feel like that's like something I love to see when I'm in this work. And I feel that folks that I work with and the youth and the adults always like also help me be a better person, be able to be more confident in myself, and I just like feel love and taken care of. And I love to see how that has just been throughout the program. Everybody's taking care of each other like in that way, and actually see your authentic self. So that's something that I love to see in trauma transformation, the work we're doing at Tia Chucha. And in the future, I just hope that we can keep going with these programs, and keep hiring more folks that were in the classes to run the project and to be the ones teaching and mentoring. That's what I would like to see, is just keep expanding. And that's what we actually are expanding into. More of the adult prisons we just got notice that we can start our program in person. So that's something that I just hope that it keeps going and keeps just growing in our classrooms and also our team.
Thank you, Rebecca. I can't imagine how hard it is to coordinate all of those moving parts. So thank you so much for that incredible work. Everybody has kind of in one way or another answered this question, but I wanted to ask because it was put in the chat, and you might have something else to add, but how has participating in this project transformed you? How have you been transformed by this work? And I know everybody has kind of touched on it, but if anybody
let me be the first one here. But I think when anybody heals, the rest of us heal. Healing is a mutually reciprocal thing. So it's not just, this person's healed. Like doctors tend to do that in the Western medicine world. I'm healing you, you're healed. I may not be healed, but actually in indigenous cultures around the world, every healer also healed. And not only that, we go further. You heal the ancestors. We bring in this idea of ancestors, that we have generations before us and generations after us. The healing we do now helps heal the ancestors, but also sets the ground for the healing of future generations. We heal now because we want our kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, several generations down the line to be in a more whole, healing place. So I have to say that all of this is transformative to me personally, but I look at it as transformative from all these generations before and after.
It reminds me of something Michael Meade once said at the men's group we had, where he said, every healer was sick. Every healer was sick. And that's another thing about, the tradition of, connecting with our ancestors, is we understood that. Whereas today's society, we're under this preconceived notion that the people who heal us are the people who have never been sick. They're the healthiest people in the world. But in order for you to heal, you have to have sickness. You have to have an understanding, a personal understanding of the sickness. And I always say that in regards to gangs, I talk to the youth and I talk to especially the adults. I say, man, if gangs was the poison that was used to sicken in our community and destroy our community, then antivenom will be what's necessary to give it health. And how they use antivenom is the poison itself from the snake. Just treat it. Just treat it. So when we start doing healing work, only thing that is, we're treated poison. We're antivenom. And we're the exact thing that's necessary to go back into our societies and be able to treat the illness that we were actually responsible for.
Thank you, everyone. Because of time, I'm going to go ahead, if it's okay with folks. We're going to close out. I just wanted to end by thanking all of you for the collective work in healing our communities. We're taking so many lessons from your efforts and from your work. We learned about the importance of centering those most impacted, right? Formerly incarcerated people doing the work, right? We learned that people in pain often engage in substance use to self-medicate. That's in the film, right? We learned that people who harm others often carry tremendous pain and trauma with them. We also learned that ideas about masculinity, how to be a man, don't just harm women, but they also harm men. That prisons do not help people heal inside, and that they often lead to more pain and more trauma. And finally, we learned that accountability does not have to be punitive, that we can collectively heal without resorting to the same practices that are used in the oppression of our communities. Part of our community liberation efforts must include ways of moving away from punitive responses. How do we not just address harm with more harm, but actually enable the transformation of everyone involved, including those that hurt others? So these are really incredible, important lessons and questions that the film raises, that your work raises. And I'm just so grateful for all of you for the work, for inviting me to be part of this space, for inviting me to build community with you. And I just want to end with a quote from Black revolutionary Assata Shakur, who is formerly incarcerated. She escaped, she sought refuge in Cuba. And she said, dreams and reality are opposites. Action synthesizes them. So thank you, everyone, for all of your actions in building the world that we envision our communities deserve. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you.